You're an agribusiness executive navigating an increasingly competitive market while trying to grow your company. Mergers and acquisitions are pitched as an accelerant to growth, but many M&A deals destroy more value than they create. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches for successful mergers and acquisitions. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosher.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod. I am your host, Joe Mosher. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to join and listen in today. These episodes are not meant to be time-bound, but as I'm recording this, I'm looking out the window, looking north in the hills up our property, and we're in mid-December. There's not a lot of snow on the ground, but it's cold enough to remind you that it is, in fact, going into the winter season. And this episode is going to air in late December of 2023. And myself and the clients that I'm talking to, and I'm sure many of you, we're all in this time of slowing down. We're in a time of clearing our heads. We're putting a bow on things, figuratively and literally. We're putting a bow on projects. We're putting a bow on presents. And we're also taking measure of where things stand and hopefully reflecting not just on the state of the business, but also how we got to where we are at this moment. It's also a time for many of you of preparing reports and charts and slides and commentary. Maybe it's for the board of directors, maybe it's for your investor group, maybe it's for your employees or your ag supply chain partners. Whatever it is, it's a time where we're all taking stock of the last year and we're trying to answer that question of how did we do? And in that spirit of reflection and of closing a year on the eve of starting another, I thought it'd be good for us to spend just a few minutes today talking about some of the very simple but very impactful questions that I think you should be asking yourself and your leadership team. Questions that you can ask that'll provide a very clear view on yesterday. My experience in this business and in this industry is that we're all very wired to look ahead. We're all preoccupied with the work undone, the challenges unmet, the markets unserved or underserved, wherever it might be. And we're very much inclined to look ahead and not take a whole lot of time of looking back, of not looking back at how we did. And maybe that's because we don't want to be self-congratulatory. Maybe it's because we don't like what we might find. Maybe it's because we just aren't concerned with yesterday. We're preoccupied with tomorrow. But looking back can really improve your sight for when you do invariably shift to the year ahead. And so I want to talk through just a couple of things today. And here's the plan. I want to talk to you about looking at your goals from the last year and taking a holistic view on what they tell you about your business. We're going to talk about the value of surprises that you might have experienced over the last year. Generally, I say no surprises are good, no surprises are additive, but sometimes in hindsight, we can learn a lot from our surprises. And we're going to talk about what change over the last year tells us about our businesses, specifically about the business that we have today and the business that we want to create. So let's get started. The first thing I think we all need to be doing and spending time on is starting with the basics, and that is our goals. And this is by far the easiest part to do, assuming that you've done that work up front. And I say that because oftentimes meeting with companies, they do have their dashboards. They do have their reports. They do have their numbers that they're looking at, maybe at a company level, probably at a functional level, definitely at a department level, but oftentimes they're not necessarily in an integrated, proactively thought out fashion, or they're perhaps legacy goals that get reported on every single year. So for this, I'm presuming that you actually did some work up front to say, what are the key metrics that we're going to look at for the next 12 months? And so as you do that, the first thing you want to do is just recenter, get calibrated on what did we measure? What were the things that we said a year ago were important to us? And now let me also just say, I know that not everybody ends their fiscal year in December. And so perhaps this is not the right time for this discussion in your business, but bookmark this for when that end of year does come, because it'll be just as important then as it is now. But talk about what did you measure? And then how did you do against your target? Again, this is pretty basic, pretty obvious stuff, but you might be surprised that you find out, okay, we do actually have a measurement for whatever we were looking at. Maybe that was volume produced or gross margin or additional acres served or new products brought to market, whatever that is. You might have the number, but did you do the work of saying, here's what the goal is, here's what good looks like, here's the threshold we're trying to meet or exceed? So think about that and ask, how did you do against your target? And then this is where the fun part comes in. Once you've recalibrated on what you measured and how you did against target, now ask yourself, were they even the right metrics? And this generally starts all kinds of interesting conversation because we have the benefit of hindsight. But very commonly with clients, we see people are measuring revenue or measuring volume produced or volume handled, whatever it might be. They're definitely looking at gross margin. They're looking at market share. And those are all relevant metrics for most businesses, but they're not comprehensive. They're not complete. They don't tell you the whole picture. So if we think about the last year where we had a lot of constrained credit, tight liquidity, the Fed going on its most aggressive tightening cycles in recent memory, perhaps ever, maybe gross margin, volume, and revenue were not all you should be looking at. Perhaps, and this is a time to reflect and say, we have a capital-intensive business. Let's look at working capital optimization or inventory turnover, our cash conversion cycles. How good are we at cash management in this business and helping use it in the most capital efficient way to support growth while minimizing our exposure to very high borrowing costs in the marketplace? Maybe you should have measured things like, what's our exposure and participation in supply chains of higher value products? Are we increasingly becoming more prevalent in commoditized legacy spaces, and are we underrepresented in those higher value product chains? Maybe that's something you should be thinking about. What about innovation? What about R&D? How many new products have we brought to market? How many new solutions have we delivered? How many problems have we solved? At this year, and at this point in the year, you can only look back on what you intended to measure. You don't want to invest a lot of time and energy in recreating dashboards and going back and doing as-of-date reports and trying to create from the ether a new view on the year. But I think you should assess whether you measured the right things. And as you assess whether you measure the right things, ask yourself these two questions. Do they reflect, the things we measure, do they reflect the most pressing issues in our present or expected economic conditions? Think about the conditions in which we're going to operate. Are these the right things to be thinking about? And also, do these measures that we have in place, do they indicate or tell us anything about our strategy? Does winning in these metrics tell us that we're actually making progress against our strategic objectives? Now, this is something we're going to talk about next week in the New Year episode. But again, it's really important to ask yourself those questions. As you look back at your metrics from last year, we've already talked about, were they complete? Were they right ones? Did you have them? Did you actually measure them? Do they reflect what you think the economic conditions are going to require from you in the year ahead? And are they going to tell you if you're making progress against your strategy and strategic objectives?
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
And so this brings me to the second part of today's episode, and that's looking at what we learned. So in this first section, we focus on what we expected, and now we need to talk about what we learned, what was different, what surprised us. And I'm talking about the kinds of things that were never part of the plan, that were never part of the dashboard, that if you went back 12 months ago, still wouldn't have been on the dashboard. But as you look at them now, they have a very material impact on the results that you produced over the last 12 months. And the question you want to ask is, what surprised us? The challenge is here, this is not something that's going to be easily quantifiable. It's not something you can set a threshold and then measure it and have a bar chart or a spidergram or any sort of plotting and a visualization. This is a qualitative discussion. What surprised us? Did we suddenly find a competitor? One of our fierce traditional competitors, did they exit the marketplace? Along the supply chain, was there the launch of a new digitalization tool that radically changed how customers and suppliers transacted, or the way information flowed through the supply chain, or the way equipment was operated, the way products were applied in the field, the way risk was managed, whatever it might be? Are there new tools in the marketplace? Did we experience difficulty breaking into a new market, into a target market that you have explicitly said you want to break into, and you experience some unexpected turbulence, some barriers you never saw coming? Or maybe even around your business were the moats that you had, perhaps not as wide or as deep as you thought. Now, as you think about these questions, and those are just examples, but you think about what surprised us, and they could be surprises to the upside or surprises to the downside. What does that tell you about the next year? How do you think about and digest and then ultimately leverage those surprises with what you see now about your metrics to help inform a different approach for next year? We can't undo surprises. They generally are to the downside, sometimes to the upside. We can't undo them. All we can do is learn from them. And taking the time to reflect upon them and to build them in to your plan for next year and how you're going to measure and focus how you validate your progress and your success is a very important thing to spend time on at this time of year. And finally, I like to ask all of our clients when we do end of year reviews, how is the business different now than it was a year ago? So regardless of your strategy or your metrics or the competitive landscape in which you operate, what are the parts of your business where you're better off than a year ago? Take the moment to talk about them. It could be big wins and small wins. And the point here is not to necessarily be looking for places to, again, get self-congratulatory or do any navel gazing and get too preoccupied with how great you think you are. But again, it's divorced from strategy. Maybe all your efforts were around improving product quality. But when you look back, you realize, wow, we really knocked it out of the park and we got much better at distribution and on-time delivery. That's an important thing to think about. Similarly, it's also really good to say, where do you feel that you're worse off now than you were 12 months ago? So kind of counterbalance that. Again, divorced from strategy and metrics. Where do we think we actually, not that we underperformed, but we as a company, whether it's in terms of people, process, technology, execution, whatever it is, where do we think we're worse off than we were a year ago? And now as you do this, resist the urge to hold someone accountable. Resist the urge to create an action plan. Because for both those questions of where are we better, as well as where are we worse off, you want to ask this: does that improvement or degradation matter? This is the ultimate point of validating and weighting the importance of it. Where we are better, does it actually have an impact on how we compete? If it does, what can we do to accelerate that improvement? Where we're worse off, does it actually result in diminished earnings, diminished revenue, diminished positioning relative to our competition, diminished execution? And if it does, then that needs to be a focus area for the next year. But on the flip side, you might look at these things and say, there's some places where we're a lot better than we were last year. And that's great. Let's feel good about that. And there's some areas where, we're not where we were a year ago, and that's disappointing. But if they don't really matter, then you need to really control your urge to spend much time on them, because you have finite time, you have finite attention, you have finite resources, finite energy among your teams. Focus on the things that matter. If the answer is no, that it's not important, then these are just observations. But if yes, they do have a material impact on your future success, then obviously they need more attention and they can be rolled into your objectives and metrics for the next year. So that's it. That's the 3 things that we try to walk through with the folks that we work with to try to put a different perspective, put a broader lens on looking at end-of-year recaps. And so let me come back again and talk to you about it in the simplest of terms. The first thing is, what does your performance against your goals tell you about the trajectory of your business? And if your goals don't tell you much, are they the right goals? That's the first thing you want to do. The second, what surprised you about the last year? Was it to the upside? Was it to the downside? Does it matter? And what does this tell you about the year ahead? And finally, are you better now than you were a year ago? Or are you worse off than you were a year ago? And if yes, that you're better off, is that something worth celebrating, replicating? If no, you're worse off, same thing. Is that something worth resolving and solving for? Or do you simply acknowledge it, try not to make that mistake again, and move on? My goal here today is to try to expand your thinking about how assessing progress on both that tactical and the strategic front, as we near the end of the calendar year, can really help put a bow on the closeout of the year. And again, this is something you can apply whenever your fiscal year end closes. So I recognize that many of us are going to be closing years in May, June, July. That's part of the agricultural sector and community, but I think it's also timely this time of year to put it out here. Explicit goals and rigorous metrics are valuable only if they're the right goals, and only if they account for the fact that your business is not static. Your business isn't static. Your market isn't static. The customers and competition are constantly moving. And so your goals need to evolve too. And I also wanted to reinforce that hitting goals is important. But if you're so myopically focused on that as an indication of performance, you can really underperform. It is possible to miss a goal, but dramatically improve your business. While we've also seen sometimes you can exceed a goal while doing great harm to the company and your people. So perhaps you miss your volume production targets, but you capture such operational efficiencies and distribution and customer relationships that in the aggregate, you fall short of your volume, but you actually deliver better results than expected. Similarly, you can outperform on sales recorded, sales transactions won in the marketplace. But if you do it in a way that's so operationally inefficient that it destroys your margin, then what have you actually done that's worth celebrating? Success is not binary. And so we want to make sure that we're looking through, as we look through the rear view over the last 12 months, it's not about ones and zeros, that we have the context and the perspective to answer that fully and confidently. Are we better? Did we win? What did we learn? What do we do next? So I hope this has been a valuable use of your time, and that as you reflect on the year, I hope you find a lot to be proud of. And I hope you find a lot that's worth celebrating. And in doing so, that you also identify ways to better articulate, to better guide, to better measure, and to ultimately better reward progress and performance in the year ahead. That's all for today. I just want to close by saying thank you for being a part of the Pacesetter Pod community this year. We appreciate you tuning in each week and listening. We appreciate your feedback. We want to make this the best program serving you in your growth and strategic objectives. And so let us know what we can do to improve in the year ahead. A reminder to like and subscribe to the Pacesetter Pod wherever you get your podcasts. And I encourage you to get in touch with me, Joe Mosher, on LinkedIn, or by setting up a call directly with me on our website, moshercg.com. Happy holidays, everyone. Be safe. We'll talk to you again in the new year.
This is the podcastfactory.com.